Hello, and welcome to my channel, Virochana Asura. The title of this video is Chart Analysis, the '08 Depression or Financial Crisis. This study will be undertaken using very basic techniques of Vedic astrology. The time of the event is based upon the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, which was the initiating force for the crisis. This was September 15th, 2008 at 0:55 hours in New York City, New York. We might say that the theme of this chart is an astrological study in sociopathy. That said, let us begin. The ascendant of the chart is Gemini. The ascendant lord, who is the planet or planetary energy presiding over this chart, representing the financial crisis, is Mercury. He rules the areas of commerce, communication, and also games, so it is not surprising he is prominent in the chart for this economic event. The first factor to examine is the state of the ascendant lord. While he is exalted in Virgo, this does not mean that he will necessarily always give good results. Not only is he negatively aspected by Rahu, but he is conjunct two planets which are poorly placed. Mercury is a planet who acts like whomever he is with in the chart. Thus, that he is in a toxic stew indicates that he will generally be toxic. Thus, there is a more negative tone to this house, the first house of the ascendant, which he rules. The NAKSHATRA, or lunar asterism, which is providing the deeper level of energy over this event through the ascendant, is Arda. The emphasis of Arda is on the mind and thinking, we might say mentality. The negative inflection of Arda on the ascendant can generate craftiness, deception, and subterfuge. That it is ruled by Rahu would then bring his energy into play in this house, which is the first house, reflecting the personality. Gemini itself is a very synergistic and dual sign which enjoys communication, games, and ingenuity. It is also, as said, very dual. These games can be fun, but they can also be destructive. Because of the poor state of the ruler of the house, Mercury, who is badly placed, this sign will be expressing itself through its darker aspects, which are deceit and manipulation. What better expression could there be for the shady business practices ruled by Mercury, which played such a role in creating the depression? It is also fitting that this sign should be the ascendant because Gemini, with his game's shifting nature and mathematical traits, is the ruler of the areas of life such as the stock market. The role of the stock market will be prominent in the crisis because this is the first house. Mercury is not Jupiter's enemy, but Jupiter is the enemy of Mercury. Jupiter, who is the significator of religion, philosophy, and morality, is in a negative aspect on this house of Mercury, thus meaning that there will be unethical behavior through commerce. This negative effect of Jupiter not only amplifies these agitated energies, which is what Jupiter does energetically, but harmonizes with the shadow side of both Gemini and Arda. Because this is the ascendant and the personality, Jupiter's negative aspects here could make someone too clever and having an overly optimistic view of their own skills, particularly in houses ruled by Mercury of, say, math or business acumen. Thus, the mindset of those who created this crisis was that they thought they were simply too smart for this to happen to them. We see from this here the first reference to the sociopathy, which will echo through the chart and will be built up in a much clearer pattern as we proceed. Second house is Cancer, and KETU is placed in the second house at 22 degrees. Cancer is the sign of nurturing and emotions. It is also a water sign and as such related to fluidity. The ruler of the sign is the moon, who both has a negative aspect from a shadow of Saturn and is poorly conjunct. This then is the energy which will be radiating through his house here in Cancer. We might say that these are agitated dark waters. The shadow planet of KETU in Cancer is in an enemy sign. Thus, unless well supported by positive aspects or conjunctions, the shadow planet will tend to give his more unpleasant results. It can create an inclination towards materialism and emotional instability, especially in water signs such as Cancer. Given the poor state of the moon and his chaotic individuality, as we shall see in a little bit, there is also a disregard for others reflected in this placement. KETU represents detachment. Here, this can be detachment from emotions or simply not caring or experiencing any emotional consequences for one's actions, like those that we saw in the first house, the Ascendant. This, of course, is the classic definition of a sociopath. The nakshatra in which KETU sits is Ashlesha. This can create a thoughtful mind and one which deeply examines issues. Now, to understand how the asterism will shine, we need to examine the ruler, who is Mercury. As seen, Mercury is expressing his shadow side, so this will manifest the dark side of this nakshatra, which will tend to be worry, fear, and anxiety. The second house is that of wealth and resources. Cancer, as the second house, can reflect, I might say in a chart of this type, not only emotions per se, but also fluidity of second house matters, in this case money. There are some authorities who say that the possessive aspect of Cancer is emphasized when it is the second house, and that this is a place where people need to learn to depend more on their own resources. In other words, the wealth and resources involved in the crisis are other people's money, and that's what those who have perpetrated this were depending upon. Because Cancer is the natural fourth house, there's a subtle connection here with the idea of the mother. There is also a hint of the mother's resources. In this chart, this represents the country and the national resources, which are in effect symbolically the mother, and have in fact been sunk into the crisis. KETU in the second house, especially malefic, will be restless, unsettled, and create a waste of resources and high expenditures. This certainly reflects the state of what our common mother, the country, gave to try and resolve the crisis. It might not be too much of an exaggeration to say that sociopaths who like to play dark games, as we saw in the Ascendant, are controlling the second house, which represents these resources which are not, again, their own. I mention again the detachment of concern for others coming from the moon. This is another data point to establish our pattern, as said. The third house is Leo. Saturn is sitting there at 19 degrees and the Sun at 28 degrees. Thus, there is a Saturn-Sun conjunction. In this conjunction of Saturn and the Sun, the lowest degree is being held by Saturn. Thus, he is the dominant force in the conjunction, and his cold shadow has fallen across the Sun. The Sun in this sign, which is his own, often represents the world of politics or perhaps major corporations. What is happening in this conjunction is that the sphere of activities are being overshadowed by the dark clouds of Saturn. And this, Saturn will create anxiety, fear, and uncertainty. Saturn here is in an enemy sign, thus he will not be giving good results. He is also in mutual aspect with the moon, who is in Saturn's sign, so the chaotic energy of the moon's conjunction with Uranus is irritating Saturn as well. A combative and irritated Saturn, Lord Shani, ain't good. Saturn can do a great deal of damage. Saturn is placed in Purva Phalguni, which is instrumental in bringing forces into manifestation. Because the ruler of the lunar mansion, Venus, is debilitated and negatively aspected, when working with an annoyed Saturn, it will be very troublesome what is being brought into manifestation. The shadow side of the nakshatra, which is bringing into the political and corporate spheres of the sign of Leo, is arrogance and narcissism, even black magic. It is black magic because it is bringing into manifestation these narcissistic aims. This is the effect of this is a miasma of anxiety. Where again we see another data point of our pattern. Beside the realm of authority, the Sun also represents gold. The physical metal, of course, did well during the crisis, but here this may mean solid economic value. A shadow of anxiety certainly fell across the valuation of the dollar. However, in one of the few pieces of good news in this chart, the Sun will eventually shine through, as he almost always does. Because he is in Leo, it may indicate that there will be a political solution to the depression. One factor that will aid the Sun in his eventual triumph is his placement in his own sign, as said, but also he is sitting in Uttara Phalguni, which is his own nakshatra. This asterism is ruled by Lord Aryaman, who helps those in need and seeks to relieve human suffering. It is the star of patronage. The Sun may bring success through experimental means under this influence, or some approach of the yet unknown. Now, a hard money advocate, those who believe that currency should be backed by solid resources such as precious metals, could read this that gold is the solution. Or, perhaps more likely, a return to real value in the political sphere will be a role in the solution. Because Jupiter is here, he will support the Sun. Jupiter is neutral towards Saturn, so he is not hurting that. In this house, the ruler of the third house is here in the third, which is the Sun. In a positive way, this can give a love of adventure and a focus on sales and marketing. However, negatively inflected, this creates the sort of situation where one cannot see the forest for the trees and the adventure turns negative. Now, this first negative point is echoing a bit of what we saw in the Ascendant regarding people who were not as smart as they were. So this is another pattern that we're seeing in the chart. Now, the ruler of the ninth house in the third house here is Saturn. This is parallel to the effects of the sun in that it can bring courage, but a failure to reason things out properly. Again, another data point in that pattern, which can create difficult problems. As it is Saturn, this can be related to law or banking, or perhaps both. There is also a strong element of propaganda from this placement. As it is expressed through Saturn here, that will involve fear. Now, this is an event and an example of the event that we can see literally manifested in the world. You may remember when Secretary Paulson was crying from the rooftops, speaking for the sun or the government, that unless the country, in other words the mother, used her resources, the second house, to bail out the banks, that there would be no money in the ATMs. So here we have the anxiety and propaganda from Saturn. The fourth house is Virgo. In Virgo, we have Mars at 23 degrees, Venus at 25 degrees, and also Mercury at 25 degrees. So we have a triple conjunction. The lowest degree of this triple conjunction is Mars, thus it is his energy which is the dominant force. Under other circumstances, this is a conjunction which would be highly beneficial for business and particularly sales. However, the circumstances of the chart are reflected in the fact that these activities have become very corrupted and they are manifesting in a negative way. This conjunction in Virgo in many ways represents the immediate causal nexus of the crisis. Mars is located in an enemy sign here, so he is poorly placed. This is generating a more negative influence from him, especially since his enemy Mercury, is directly there. Besides matters such as fighting, logic, and engineering, Mars is the significator of real estate and property. When we realize that this is the fourth house representing the home, we see that this is quite literally a housing and real estate crisis. So the very nature of the crisis is clearly reflected in the chart. Venus is debilitated in Virgo. This reflects a loss of comfort and luxury. But perhaps more important, Venus is what guides us to make good decisions for our greater fulfillment over the long term. Here, because he's debilitated, it can make one short-sighted. And here again, the lack of concern for long-term possibilities is exactly what was involved in this crisis. Mercury is exalted in Virgo. So one might think that the exaltation and the debilitation of Venus might, say, cancel each other out. However, this is not the case. The reason is that Mercury acts like whomever he's with, as mentioned earlier. Thus, in this situation, all of his exalted energy is going to be turned negative. With 3 planets sitting in it, the lunar mansion of Chitra is a powerful presence in the chart. Unfortunately, because the ruler is the poorly placed Mars, and this is in the sign of toxic Mercury, the nakshatra is not going to yield its optimum results. Chitra is called the star of opportunity. It is also a placement which heightens desire. Because desire is such a force within this array of energy, negatively inflected, it can bring about arrogant and self-centered behavior. Like Purva Phalguni, there is also association with black magic, and specifically illusion. Again, black magic here is probably not Satanist conjuring devils, although some do think that this was a factor in the crisis, and perhaps they might find some support for that in these 2 nakshatras. But more likely, it is individuals with their negative power drive creating situations from which they can feed their lower desires without concerns of how this will affect others. It should be noted, Rahu, who is aspecting this placement, and thus his influences here, is the master of illusion. He is the black wizard. He is a vector to amplify this result then. The games of Mercury which created the crisis were all based on illusion for self-centered gain. Thus, the dominant nakshatra in the chart reinforces the pattern of sociopathy that is found here. In addition to the environment of this sign, this conjunction is, as mentioned, being negatively aspected by Rahu from the 8th house. Thus, he is casting his own impulse for short-term gains, cutting corners and illusions on a conjunction which is already adversely affecting the practical matters of Virgo. From here, it is also dragging down the 10th house of career as well, as we shall see. In this sign, the ruler of the 1st house is in the 4th house, which is Mercury. Now, this will give a focus on luxury and, we find again, real estate. The negative, which is more likely to be manifest given the toxic Mercury, is a loss of these matters and an insufficient education. Note, this lack of education and understanding is also reflected in the house placements of Sun, Saturn, and the 1st house as well. It is also seen in the debilitated Venus. This pattern indicates that many people who thought they knew what they were doing clearly didn't. The ruler of the 11th house is in the 4th house as well, which is Mars. This is a placement which generates issues involving real estate, once again, buildings and hotels. So we're getting a little more detailed in some areas here. Because Mars is negatively placed, this reflects difficulties with these assets, which is in harmony with the effects of the placement of Mercury. Thus, this will be emphasized. Also, the ruler of the 5th house is in the 4th house, who is Venus. Because Venus is debilitated, this bad placement can foster loss of real estate and economic comfort through speculation and a lack of understanding. So we see these things are very consistent through the chart. So this consistency of these results in these placements and the explanations they provide just in themselves could be an outline for the 2008 financial crisis, like anything that would have been found in the newspapers at the time. The fifth house is Libra. The ruler of this house is Venus, who is debilitated, poorly conjunct, and aspected. The fifth house is that of progeny. Libra is the sign of balance, harmony, and diplomacy. Business and law are also seen from here. The poor state of Venus will adversely affect all of these areas in the crisis. As mentioned previously, Venus is the planet which guides one to make good choices for one's long-term improvement and benefit. Thus debilitated, it may create bad business decisions. These can also involve legal matters and potentially lawsuits. Pardon me. Not only is this house weakened because of the state of the ruler, Venus, but it has two negative aspects looking at it as well. While there are no planets here, it is still energetically manifesting within the chart. Saturn is bringing his political anxiety and KETU, his disregard for others, into the sign of balance and diplomacy and the fifth house. Because this is the house of progeny, one way of potentially reading this is that the younger generation of the time is the one that will be hardest hit by the crisis. The sixth house in this chart is Scorpio. The ruler of this house is Mars, who is poorly placed. Scorpio is a sign of passion, but also what is hidden. The sixth house is that of enemies, debts, and illnesses. While there are no planets here, that its ruler is poorly placed means that a negative energy permeates this house. Because this is the house of Mars and debts, which Mars rules, it may also support the idea that real estate will be an important factor in the debt and manifestation of the illness, if you will, of the financial crisis. As this is a fire sign, the influence of these sixth house matters can be highly energized. Because it is Scorpio, it means that much of this is going to be hidden from public view. Thus, the amount of debt and the degree of the economic influence of the crisis may not be fully publicly known. The seventh house of this chart is Sagittarius. Jupiter is placed there at 18 degrees. The ruler of this house is Jupiter, and he is well placed in his own sign. Sagittarius is the sign of our higher learning and education. Because he is in the seventh house of relationships, this is considered an auspicious placement. Jupiter here will expand the matters of this house and bring his benefic light upon them. But it may not always be perceived that way by the public. There are few bright spots in this chart. However, one is found in the planet Jupiter in some ways. He is well placed in his own sign in Sagittarius. The ascendant lord of the chart, Mercury, is neutral towards Jupiter, so that is not inhibiting him, although he is the enemy of Mercury on his end. Also, at 18 degrees, he is not too weak from being at a lower or higher degree of the sign. Jupiter in Sagittarius can prove helpful in financial matters. Jupiter as a planet can bring counsel, morality, opportunities, and luck. Jupiter's influence through its placement and aspects is the gravity that has perhaps in some ways kept things in the crisis from being worse than they might have been. The lunar mansion of Purva Ashlesha can reflect a very philosophical and spiritual nature. This harmonizes well with the teacher or guru of Jupiter in the sign of Sagittarius. Basically, ethically and intellectually, Jupiter represents the force that was trying to put the brakes on the crisis and trying to influence it in a more reflective and thoughtful way, however that may have manifested within these corporations. Jupiter here is aspected by Mars, who is his friend, so this can actually be supportive. So here in this house, we have the ruler of the seventh house in the seventh house. On the positive side, this placement can give benefit from partnerships and social connections. The flip side is represented by manipulation and broken contracts. So this then is the astrological genesis of the bailout. Many government officials who had oversight and influence on these matters in the Treasury Department and in the cabinet were, of course, former executives of the same Wall Street banks that were given bailouts by the seventh house. Thus, their partnerships and social connections provided a benefit. As I said, the public might not always see the influence of Jupiter here as idealistically benefic from our vantage point. It was also common, it should be noted, that the money did not go for what it was intended. This was the broken contract aspect of the influence of this placement. AIG, for example, each spent $30,000 on pedicures with public money. The eighth house in this chart is Capricorn. Rahu is sitting in this house at 22 degrees and Neptune at 28 degrees. There is thus a Rahu-Neptune conjunction. Pardon me. The ruler of Capricorn is Saturn, and he is poorly placed in conjunction with an enemy and in that enemy's sign. Thus, the cold shadow of Saturn is the night in which Rahu will play with all his malefic nature unbound. Here, like that old Duran Duran song from the 80s, Rahu was hungry like a wolf. The eighth house is that of the unknown, the unexpected, sudden changes, and transformations. Because this is the house of the unknown, the shadow planet, who is the magician, will, as said, run wild. Rahu is in conjunction with Neptune and holding the lowest degree. The shadow planet is thus ruling that relationship. Much like Rahu, Neptune can also be related to illusion and delusion, as well as the unexpected. On his positive side, Neptune can be visionary, although a vision of what is the question. Is it going to be from Isaiah that the wolf will lay down with the lamb? Or will it be Huxley's Brave New World? Rahu's dominance in the conjunction will use Neptune's visionary abilities for malefic ends. Thus, we have a negative house of the unknown with two bodies which radiate illusion. So this is a recipe for disaster. Rahu in Capricorn can amplify yearnings for respectability and social position. It also bestows a strength of mind and thus it can potentially feed Rahu's trait of cunning. The shadow planet here will take risk to get what he wants. Rahu in himself is not necessarily poorly placed in the sign, but that it is affected by the negative qualities of the ruler will not help. To make matters worse, because Rahu is here and not restrained by Jupiter through conjunction or aspect, he will amplify the energy of Saturn where he is sitting and aspecting as well. This means the use of fear and anxiety to manipulate the public for gain through the crisis. The nakshatra of Shravana, where Rahu sits, is ruled by the moon. The moon is poorly placed, so he will not generate positive results from this asterism, except perhaps through transits or aspects. The negative side of Shravana is that it can create abstinence and jealousy. Rahu will amplify these here, and so he is driven to obtain the corporate heights and to beat everyone else, take risk no matter what it takes. He's going to cut corners. Neptune is in Dhanishta, which is ruled by Mars. As seen, Mars is poorly placed and casts a shadow over his sphere of influence. The dark side of this lunar mansion is that it can create recklessness, ruthlessness, and a vengeful nature. These placements, of course, continue the pattern of sociopathy that runs through this chart. The ninth house in this chart is Aquarius. The moon is placed there at 26 degrees, and Uranus is also placed there at exactly 26 degrees. So we have an exact moon and Uranus conjunction. The ruler of Aquarius is Saturn, and he is poorly placed in conjunction with an enemy and in his sign. It is into this dark environment that the moon, which reflects the mind, and in this chart I would say the mentality of the crisis, enters. Aquarius is the sign of independence, innovation, but also a concern for others in the community. As mentioned, the conjunction of the moon and Uranus is exact. This means that both sides are at their maximum potency. The disruptive energies of Uranus can create a scattered mentality, which is oriented towards the crazed and the rebellious. Especially since both are in a poor placement, it will have a darker tone. We find again a hint of our pattern of sociopathy. The moon in Aquarius can be interested in social reform, but it is also the most individualistic moon in the zodiac. One positive point here is that both are in a lunar mansion ruled by Jupiter, who cast some positive influence upon them. Although part of the nature of this nakshatra is the wish to escape from societal norms and rules, it can also create cynicism. Thus, the influence of Uranus on them and the moon will only be reinforced here, as well as the individualistic inflection of Aquarius upon the moon. This is the ninth house, which is the house of fortune and also higher learning. So the higher ideals reflected here are those of chaotic individuality, or we could say anarchy in the boardroom. Now, as far as our aspects, Saturn is casting his shadow across the moon. This brings the political and corporate anxiety of the crisis. The Sun is also having some influence here through aspect, but since he is dominated by Saturn in their conjunction, it is probably not a great deal. However, as stated earlier regarding the Sun, this will grow and become more positive over time. Now, in this house, the ruler of the second house is in the ninth house, which is the moon. This placement can influence areas of law and education, but because of the moon's state, it is most likely to reflect a lack of financial fortune, money troubles, and a depressed state. That, of course, would be heightened by Saturn's aspect. So this clearly echoes through the mentality of the crisis. The 10th house in this chart is Pisces. The ruler of this house is Jupiter, who is well placed. If not, we would have been in even worse trouble. The 10th house is that of career. Pisces is the natural 12th sign and the culmination of the zodiac. In other words, the goal. In this chart, the goal is reflected in the 10th house of career and employment. Because it is ruled by a well-placed Jupiter, there is strong potential for his expression in this house. However, it is receiving 4 negative aspects. The triple conjunction of Virgo is entirely radiating on this house. Jupiter and Mars are friends, which may palliate the Martian influence somewhat. But issues of trade, commerce, business, and correct public action are all being irritated by the sociopathic influence from KETU, as well as the conjunction in Virgo, which reflects the cause of the crisis. I would read the effects on this house as unemployment, since it negatively impacts career. The 11th house in this chart is Aries. The ruler of this sign, Mars, is poorly placed. A weak Mars can make him aggressive and cause him to go in search of conflict rather than using his powers to defend others. Although in this chart, Mars actually is not that weak through degree, more by other influences on him. The 11th house is that of gains. Aries is the natural first house. It can also represent executives as well as the influence of government and large corporations. So in the American context, we might read that as lobbyist. As the 11th house, this indicates that there will be benefit not only through the action of executives and lobbyists, signified by this fire sign, but from government and other companies as well. This is reflected in the crisis in the actions of those who not only received government welfare, which we saw coming from the 7th house, but used this money to acquire assets from collapsing and troubled companies. So the energy of this house allowed them to gain from it. Jupiter is a friend to Mars. This is also another subtle indication of the bailout, as Jupiter's aspect is on this house, and government aids to aid to those signified by the sign of Mars, the executives. Jupiter will expand the matters of this house, thus providing gains. These executives, unless affected by transits and changes in the Mahadasha, basically this means will get away with what they've done. Further, they will actually gain from the crisis. Karmically, I don't know what to say about that, but that is unfortunately what I'm seeing here, at least with my limited knowledge. The 12th house is Taurus. The ruler of this house is Venus, who is debilitated, poorly aspect, and conjunct. The 12th house represents that which is hidden. It can also represent prisons and secluded places. In this chart, it is the sign of Taurus, which represents practicality and materiality. Taurus is also associated with money. According to some people, money is the root of all evil, but all people agree that it is the root of the financial crisis. Not only is the ruler of this house Venus in a poor state, but it bears two negative aspects as well. Rahu is casting his chaotic and illusionary influence on the matters of this house and sign, as is Saturn, although Saturn is a friend to Venus. This may well represent hidden manipulation of capital. This factor in the chart is reinforced with Scorpio as the 6th house, also representing hidden events in the crisis. I would also hazard a guess that there is a great deal of money gained in secret from the crisis, which the public does not know. And that, of course, those who gained it, we saw in the 11th house of Aries. It was executives and lobbyists. There was a lot happening behind the scenes as indicated by this house, and whether that will be brought out over time, which was reflected by Scorpio, that remains to be seen. So this is my analysis of this chart. I certainly welcome additional comments and reflections. There is much more that could be explored and learned about this matter. Thank you very much.